Hello and welcome to our symposium. My name is Cameron Neece and I'm from Loma University. And I have the privilege of chairing this symposium entitled Evidence-Based Interventions for Individuals with Developmental Delay and ASD, a focus on Latino families. We have 3 papers in this symposium. The first will be delivered by Jonathan Safer-Lichtenstein from the University of Oregon. And his paper is entitled Feasibility and Acceptability of Parenting Interventions Delivered in Spanish to Caregivers of Children with Developmental Delays. Our second paper will be delivered by Kristina Lopez from Arizona State University. And her paper is entitled Parent-Mediated Autism Intervention Through a Culturally Informed Lens, Parents Taking Action in Pivotal Response Training with Latino Families. And our third paper will be delivered by Anne-Marie Martin from the University of California, Riverside. And her study is entitled The Social Validity of the Peers Social Skills Program for Ethnically and Linguistically Diverse Families. Finally, Dr. Sandy Magaña from the University of Texas at Austin will deliver her remarks as the discussant for this symposium, and she will do that live. And her remarks as the discussant will be followed by a question and answer time where you can ask questions to our presenters. So thank you so much for having us, and we look forward to a really great symposium. Welcome.
My presentation will look at the feasibility and acceptability of a few parenting interventions we delivered in Spanish to caregivers of children with autism and other developmental delays. So a bit of background, we know that parents of children with autism and other developmental delays are at higher risk for increased stress, and particularly if the child also has challenging behaviors. So there's benefit to developing these interventions that target both parent stress and their ability to manage these challenging behaviors. A couple promising stress reduction interventions include psychoeducation and mindfulness-based stress reduction. And then behavioral parent training is a promising intervention to help parents reduce challenging behaviors, manage those better, and it's a relatively easy to implement group-based approach. We also know existing service systems often fail to meet the needs of Hispanic, Latinx caregivers of children with developmental delays, particularly for those who are non-English speakers. So research is needed to test these existing interventions with this population to see what's feasible, what's acceptable for these individuals. So as part of, this is part of a larger study, we have this multi-site randomized control trial, sites in Oregon and Loma, California, targeting we got these two 16-week interventions, behavioral parent training combined with MBSR versus behavioral parent training combined with psychoeducation active control group. We've completed 2 groups so far, cohorts so far of English speakers in Loma Linda, and then last spring completed our first Spanish speaking cohort. So in general, our research questions are looking at is acceptability and feasibility going to differ between MBSR versus psychoeducation for our Spanish speakers? And then what about for these interventions overall for our Spanish speakers versus our English speaking cohorts? And then more qualitatively, just additional information from our Spanish speakers on how they like these interventions, what was useful, what not so much, what could we do differently moving forward, particularly in terms of cultural acceptability. So for the Spanish speaking cohort, parents had to have a child between the ages of 3 to 5 diagnosed with either autism or another developmental delay. We sent out recruitment flyers to regional centers, doctors' offices in the Loma Linda area. We ended up contacting 150, and then they called us if they were interested. And we ended up contacting 158 parents, enrolling and randomizing 60, so 30 to each condition who were interested and eligible. So in terms of procedure, we had a home visit. We did the first 6 sessions, so either the MBSR or psychoeducation piece in person as was designed. Then we had this pause of 4 weeks because it was right as COVID was starting to hit last spring. We did weekly calls with parents to make sure that they were staying engaged and then gauge their interest in potentially switching to telehealth. And then we ended up having to do that for our final 10 weeks, which was the BPT portion. So we did that entirely online. And we've since done post-treatment follow-up visits and then some focus groups also virtually. For our measures, just a snapshot from the bigger picture for this study. So we collected demographics, attendance at each session, and then a parent satisfaction questionnaire, which was 15 items, 7-point Likert scale questions gauging parent satisfaction with the different treatments. For our participants, for our Spanish-speaking cohort, pretty well matched across the 2 interventions, no differences on any of the key variables, as you can see here. Whereas looking at our Spanish-speaking cohort compared to our previous English-speaking cohorts, there were some key differences. And so we even for this broke down our English-speaking cohorts into Hispanic participants, non-Hispanic participants, since it was pretty evenly split. You can see that language was really the biggest driver of these differences in demographics. Our Spanish-speaking parents were a bit older, and then they also had lower household income and lower levels of formal education, whereas our English-speaking Hispanic group and English-speaking non-Hispanic participants were pretty similar on those different demographics measures. Looking at our satisfaction on the satisfaction survey, you can see that intervention group, so MBSR versus psychoed for all of our participants, wasn't really driving differences in satisfaction, nor was language. So Spanish versus English cohort specifically wasn't driving satisfaction differences. But what was this interesting group by language effect. So this crossover effect that you can see here. Our Spanish-speaking participants compared to the English speakers were rating the psychoeducation group as much more helpful and the MBSR group as a bit less helpful. Whereas for our English speakers, it was kind of the exact opposite. And you can see they weren't as satisfied with the psychoeducation, but were quite satisfied with the MBSR group, which was interesting. And then breaking it down further, the demographically, we're including this English-speaking Hispanic group. You can see they're kind of right in the middle of the 2 groups here, and still that crossover effect remains where our Spanish speakers, there's that big difference in terms of they were the ones who really got the most out of psychoeducation, whereas MBSR was perhaps a little bit less relevant for them. Also looking at attendance, you can see pretty similar across the language cohorts and the intervention groups in terms of proportion who attended each session. No significant differences there, and you can see the trends are even quite similar across these 4 different breakdowns. And then we also wanted to run these focus groups to get a lot more qualitative information from our participants in the Spanish-speaking cohort. This is the first time a lot of these interventions had been run with this population, Spanish-speaking Hispanic caregivers of children with disabilities. So we wanted to just hear a lot more from them about what they liked, what was difficult, what they've continued to use, things like that. So we invited any participant who had attended at least one in-person session and then at least one of the virtual sessions. And we offered a couple different times for each, but we did separate the psychoed and the MBSR participants, so they were able to talk about those their groups separately. The focus groups had these 3 sections, so things they liked, continued to use, aspects that were challenging, and then just trying to get a bit more about the cultural alignment or acceptability of different strategies. The transcripts of the focus groups were coded by myself and one other grad student. And we ended up identifying 7 themes from these focus groups. So taking a look at those themes, for the MBSR group specifically, they reported fairly inconsistent use of MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction strategies, so meditation, things like that, breathing exercises. They said a lot of parents reported it was just too difficult to find the time, they were too busy, they weren't able to do it without the group leader guiding them, things like that. A few parents did report continuing to use them, but there was kind of inconsistent adoption of this practice, it seemed. Whereas for the psychoeducation group, we heard just a lot about how powerful that information was, learning how to work with their child's school, learning how to develop the IEP, things like that. A lot of parents reported that just had increased their self-efficacy. It had changed how the school team was viewing them, and it seemed like felt a lot more empowered in their interactions with the school. And this quote by one of our BPTE psychoeducation group participants, I think really illustrates how the information from the group changed her interactions with the school. Across both groups, we had this appreciating the sense of community. So enjoyed seeing other parents who had a child with a disability, parents who looked like them, had similar stories. They liked learning from other parents. They saw them as role models and just found a lot of benefit of hearing from other parents and getting that sense of community while doing these groups. Across both groups, behavioral strategies were rated quite favorably, particularly praise and rewards. Parents were calling out as continuing to use and continuing to be helpful to motivate their children, particularly around virtual school, which was a big theme, big topic. Parents across both groups reported challenges incorporating other family members, so their spouse, their mom, their older children who take care of the child with a disability. Just getting everyone on the same page they thought was difficult, and they recommended maybe for future iterations, inviting other members of the family, trying to be as consciously inclusive of the whole family as possible, so that it wasn't just one caregiver having to distribute all these ideas across their family. In general, cultural content was rated as culturally acceptable. The strategies parents particularly said they had no problem with in general. There were video examples as part of the BPT curriculum that they did call out as perhaps not being very culturally aligned. Those videos included parents who were predominantly white. They were dubbed over into Spanish. They were older videos, not always of a child with a disability. So they thought that maybe making those videos more relevant to their lives would be an important change. And then there were mixed feelings on modality. So some parents reported that the telehealth groups were great. They liked not having to drive in and being able to do it from home, whereas other parents reported it was challenging to do from home because their kids were there, they were distracted, and they just weren't able to engage with other people the same way as they had been in person. So thinking about our discussion or our bigger takeaways here, overall attendance was comparable for our Spanish-speaking cohort compared to our English-speaking cohort, despite the latter half being via telehealth, which I think speaks to the feasibility of using these interventions with this population. They did attend at similar rates, they were engaged, things like that. And then the psychoeducation support group elements and sense of community were just really well received by the Spanish-speaking cohort. Particularly, we saw in that crossover effect that the parents really liked the psychoeducation information. They didn't treat it as a control group where they really did get a lot of benefit from it and reported specifically how. Behavioral strategies were pretty well received by both groups. And then just more mixed findings on this MBSR strategies, telehealth delivery, ability to involve other family members. So I think it'll take some further looking into some of these aspects to figure out what'll be most relevant and most useful for future groups moving forward. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me in this symposium. My name is Anne-Marie Martin, and I'm going to be talking about the social validity of the PEERS program for culturally and linguistically diverse families. As an introduction, autism spectrum disorder represents a heterogeneous group of disorders that has been a challenge to diagnose and treat. Although there is some natural improvement in overall functioning during adolescence and young adulthood, social skill deficits are pervasive. This means that regardless of where an individual falls on the spectrum of phenotypic presentations, they will still struggle with things like understanding appropriate boundaries and nuanced social communication. Thus, it is crucial to target skills during adolescence when the social demands increase and adolescents are at risk of social isolation, depression, and anxiety. The PEERS program teaches ecologically validated social skills that are the foundation to making friendships. However, studies using PEERS has been validated using largely white samples. Latinx participants have been historically underrepresented in the intervention literature, even though they are one of the fastest growing demographics. There are several important considerations when working with Latinx families, which we'll be covering in this presentation. The objective of this study was to determine if Both parents and adolescents find the peers program to be valid and useful. And were any cultural adaptations necessary? If so, were adaptations influenced by language, income, or level of acculturation? Two non-randomized consecutive groups were run using the parent-assisted 16-week program. Time points were approximately 4 months apart. Group 1 had 7 participants. Group 2 had 6 participants for a total of 13 adolescents and their families who completed the program. Over half of the sample identified as Latinx. 10 participants were predominantly English-speaking, while 3 of the families identified as predominantly Spanish-speaking. All teens were English-speaking. These are some of the measures that were used for the present study. Most importantly, what we'll be focusing on is the social validity interview that was conducted at post and again at 4-month follow-up. So, social validity for adolescents was measured using the acceptability and satisfaction tenet of Wolf's framework. Overall program acceptability was determined by measures of program usefulness to determine whether the ends justified the level of investment required to complete a rigorous 16-week program. Adolescents were allowed to elaborate and provide multiple answers, which were then grouped into the following program domains. I have highlighted in red the strongest themes and subthemes that emerged in analyzing adolescent responses. Of note, content had the highest rating of helpfulness, but was also named as least helpful by 3 teens. While 5 teens enjoyed the knowledge that was provided by the program, a few teens took issue with certain lessons, most commonly on how to change your reputation. Homework was also named as least helpful program feature. The homework assignment of get-togethers or organizing an outing with a friend mirrored parent responses as well. In fact, this theme came up several times throughout different portions of the analyses as being particularly difficult for Latinx families. However, all 13 teens expressed satisfaction in completing the program and would recommend it to other teens. Now, social validity for parents was measured using the acceptability, goals, and satisfaction tenets of Wolf's framework. Overall program acceptability was determined by measures of program usefulness. Parents, like adolescents, were allowed to elaborate and provide multiple answers, which were then grouped into the same program domains. Content had the highest rating of helpfulness, and like teens, parents enjoyed the budding friendships that occurred between group members as the program went on. Now, parents disliked the homework almost twice as much as their teens did, partially because of the amount of homework assigned, and for some parents, cultural differences that made the homework assignment of get-togethers to be anxiety-provoking. Parents were asked about behavior changes and effectiveness in order to understand the social significance of targeted skills. Despite the variation of level of social change they observed in their adolescent, all parents were satisfied with the intervention and rated it highly on the intervention rating profile, or IRP 15. Although the focus of the second research question is on cultural adaptations and factors that influence parent suggestions, responses were also collected from teens to understand their perceptions of the peers program and if there were any adaptations that they would suggest to improve their experience in the program. For the most part, adaptations were minor, such as improving the room's general appearance or incorporating music as a way to increase their attention and motivation. However, there were some notable contributions. One adolescent suggested including a lesson on relationships and dating, which is included in the Peers for Young Adults program, but it shows that teens are also thinking about relationships and would value this information. it might be helpful to offer an adapted, age-appropriate version of the lesson. A few teens would have preferred more stringent rules regarding homework completion and participation to make the group sessions more productive, while 7 participants had no feedback. All parents recommended the program, but the majority had suggestions for changes. Transitioning from a phone call to a get-together was difficult for teens without established friendships outside the group. One parent suggested creating a homework assignment in between the two, where group members were assigned to host get-togethers outside of group session to practice and prepare them for get-togethers with other peers. Now, level of acculturation did impact parent experiences, but not in the way originally hypothesized, where lower levels of acculturation meant greater program impact. In fact, higher acculturation, like first or second generation families, felt the greatest impact on their traditional parenting practices. The following quote has been cleaned for this presentation. I think the get-togethers was kind of hard because culturally and up to this point, we hadn't really had anyone new come into our home. And I think that me being brought up that way, it's hard for me to change even though I was born here. And my mom also, I had to talk to her as well. It's okay, we're not used to it, but again, we're from a different era. Maybe things are changing and exposure. I think that is the main thing that I've learned from peers is we have to expose them, integrate him in the community. I didn't even realize it. I didn't realize that I was limiting him by not being open to that. Additionally, both English and Spanish-speaking parents were satisfied with the bilingual administration of the group content. Depending on the family's level of English comprehension, more or less translation support was required to maintain their comfort in the group, but all families said the group felt inclusive and several enjoyed the multicultural experience. One parent said, "I think it's great. Diversity is always great." In conclusion, the concept of hosted get-togethers is not as culturally adaptable as previously thought, and it's important to consider alternatives for Latinx families. Some great options suggested by parents in the group include assigning get-togethers between group members or having get-togethers with family members. Second, white families enjoyed having Spanish-speaking families in the group. It provides an opportunity to expand their perspectives, and it gives support for bilingual group formats with translation supports as a way to increase intervention research diversity and provide an opportunity where parents are exposed to other perspectives and cultures. I like to end with one of my favorite quotes of the group. I think the thing that binds us together is much stronger than the language differences. I want to give a huge thank you to everyone who worked on this project, the families and their teens for participating in the study, and all the work that was done to carry this through a pandemic. Here is our contact information, and I want to thank you so much for joining in this talk.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kristina Lopez, and I am here today, here in my house, to talk to everybody about parent-mediated autism intervention through a culturally informed lens, parents taking action, and pivotal response training with Latino families. And I am from Arizona State University and an assistant professor in the School of Social Work. First, I'd like to talk to you for a second about race and ethnicity in the context of disability. What we know right now is that there are significant delays in diagnosis of disabilities and treatment services for racial ethnic minority children that are persistent. and the prevalence of any developmental disability is lower among Latinx children compared with children in all other race and ethnicity groups. Members of racial and ethnic minority groups who have a disability face greater health disparities and inequalities than do their peers without a disability. Racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare quality have not reduced over time. The sociocultural framework for health service disparities explains that health disparities are racial and ethnic differences in access, healthcare quality, or healthcare outcomes that are not due to clinical needs or the appropriateness of treatment. And these disparities are exacerbated by barriers to access of healthcare systems, in addition to the reduced quality of services and lack of culturally sensitive treatment and service providers. What this looks like is a very complicated framework, but essentially what it says is that there's a function of both healthcare and educational systems, as well as community system domains that interface, and domains are linked through mechanisms that create cumulative disadvantage. What this means for Latino and Black, compared to white children, Black and Latino children have more difficulty accessing specialty care. And for Latino children who receive services, parents report lower quality and appropriateness of care. Families of Black and Latino children with special health care needs consistently report their provider does not spend enough time with them or listen to them. The case for community intervention and family intervention in Arizona is the prevalence rate for ASD in Arizona is 1 in 63, which is actually lower than the national average. Although ASD can be diagnosed as early as 2, the average age is older, around 4 years and 8 months. Latinx children are less likely to be identified with ASD compared to non-Latinx children in Arizona. And there's a need to identify cultural, educational, and economic barriers to decreasing the age of evaluation and diagnosis in Latino, rural, and other underserved children. What this meant for me being here in Arizona was I developed a community level intervention of the community advisory board to initiate an intervention program. The reason I went community focused was to find out more. I'm not from Arizona. I moved here from California, and I really didn't want to engage the community without hearing about their experience with ASD services. How I went about doing that was by first identifying whether this was an issue, which was looking at the CDC data and also asking lots of questions within the community. And then identifying and mapping out the service area, which was to focus on Maricopa County. And then engagement and relationship building, which was a lot of coffees with lots of different people, and a lot of meeting in McDonald's or wherever anybody else told me they needed to meet. And then development of collaborative activities and projects, and of course, evaluation of such. The Community Advisory Board responsibilities were to identify barriers Latino families experience in the ASD diagnostic process and challenges after diagnosis. Also collaborate with the program by incorporating their knowledge of resources in the community. So they were able to identify where were the right, so to speak, culturally more informed organizations that the community trusted more, and describe strategies within the community that have proven to be successful for outreach and recruitment. The support they provided, they confirmed the need for the intervention program. They also information derived supported the successful recruitment of promotoras and participants. The board emphasized the need to be on the ground with recruitment methods. Services and supports in the area, which were known to be particularly attuned to the Latino community, were identified. An in-kind space was provided by 2 board members for use during initial assessments. The family intervention was an innovative, culturally grounded intervention, combination of parents taking action, a culturally grounded psychoeducation program for Latino families of children with ASD, and pivotal response training. PTA addresses a myriad of sociocultural factors at multiple system levels affecting disparities, and PRT addresses the identified gap in direct coaching requested by previous PTA participants. Padres en Acción, or Parents Taking Action, is rooted in previous studies. Parent participation in early intervention is critical, so that's essential to inclusivity and culturally informed psychoeducation intervention for Latino parents is needed. Parents Taking Action is based on the ecological validity model, in which each one of these dimensions is specifically culturally informed. This also includes the use of promotoras de salud, which are community health workers. And in this particular case, they were mothers of children with ASD, Latina mothers of children with ASD, shared common identity with the participant, understood the host community, were respected and visible, bridged the communication divide by being bilingual, and were trained as health educators in the Latino community. The materials for the program were 2-hour sessions in-home pre-COVID, manuals, videos, and novellas, visual resources, community resource guides, and CDC materials. The PTA curriculum includes 14 sessions. Pivotal response training was provided by students trained, also bilingual and also identified as Latina. And they were trained by the local autism center. And pivotal response training is focused on improving motivation as a central principle and is a foundational procedure for the other pivotal areas. PRT learning opportunities are specifically designed to increase child motivation to learn and interact. And PRT motivation can be defined as a high degree of child responding and initiating within social and learning environments in the presence of positive child affect. The procedure was targeted recruitment of 10 Latina mothers of children at risk or diagnosed with ASD or SCD, social communication disorder, ages 1 through 8. Recruitment through service agency referrals, support groups, and word of mouth. All participants were provided the PTA PRT intervention, 14 PTA sessions with the promotora, 4 PRT sessions with the bilingual bicultural Latina coach, baseline assessments and 2 follow-up assessments, and focus groups for all families, 4 to 5 months and 8 to 10 months post-baseline focus group at conclusion of study. The sample demographics, mother characteristics, 7 ended up completing the program, although we did recruit 10. The 3 that left the program had competing needs that did not allow them to complete. Mean age of children were 3.57. Most were married or living together. Level of education, most had some sort of post-secondary education. The annual income was pretty spread out, most employed, foreign-born, and in good health. Child characteristics, mean age, those two are reversed. Mean age in years for mom was 38.57, and most were male. CAR severity, which was used in the initial assessment, was mild to moderate symptoms for most, and then severe symptoms for one child. Paired sample t-tests for study outcomes indicated several changes. Children or moms improved in understanding their child's strengths, needs, and abilities. They also improved in knowing their rights and advocating for their children, in having a support system, in total family outcomes, which is where these measures were taken from, was a family outcome survey, and efficacy and use of the strategies specifically taught in the intervention, and frequency of using the strategies in the intervention. The discussion, community level intervention, the investment into the community facilitated the development of the Community Advisory Board. The Community Advisory Board addresses the interface of the community and treatment systems of the modified sociocultural framework for health service disparities. The CAB confirmed and contextualized the data and research knowledge available about disparities in ASD diagnosis among Latino children in AZ. The Multidisciplinary Community Advisory Board supported the successful launch of the family intervention as well. The family level intervention, the promotora model of ASD intervention delivery combined with bicultural bilingual PRT addresses the factors that influence Latinx families or children with ASD. Family outcomes are positively influenced with this culturally informed model of intervention. Parents' increase in efficacy in using strategies and frequency of using the evidence-based strategies suggests that mothers may also be able to exhibit more effective parenting. Further, mothers felt a sense of support that was unique to the shared experience with the promotoras. What this indicates is that PTA is a cost-effective, culturally informed program for Latino families with demonstrated outcomes for both children and parents. It also informs practice models and the understanding of sociocultural factors influencing disparities among Latino children with ASD and their families. The model may be useful for other ethnic and cultural groups as long as the program adaptation takes unique needs and obstacles into account and engages the community to find solutions together. PTA dissemination has been used across these different contexts. And lastly, I would like to acknowledge all the participating families and everyone who supported the program, as well as the students and the funding support from Arizona State University School of Social Work and the Watts College of Public Service. And that is it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I want to just give a few thoughts for this wonderful symposium, and I'm going to share with you a couple of slides. Let's see if it will let me. Someone giving me one option, so I'm going to share. Okay, I don't know.
We can see the slides.
You can see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to maximize it so you can see it, okay?
Perfect.
Good. So, so first I want to say that this was a really important set of presentations because it really takes a lot of hard groundwork to test interventions or develop interventions with diverse families, and in this case, Latino families. It's very labor-intensive work, and there are different approaches I can see that each of these presentations have taken, but it's definitely an iterative process. And so I'm going to outline a little bit about a process that you might consider, or that you can probably place the presentations that were given into different parts of that. But I think we just have to take a really intentional approach to reaching diverse groups and not assume that our intervention as is going to work, right? And some of those findings kind of showed that. And so just to give background, I think everybody pretty much pointed out how evidence-based interventions are not tested with culturally diverse groups, and that people can fall through the cracks. So it's super important to culturally tailor or adapt interventions. And so I'm going to share with you a couple of ideas. So one is the idea of different levels of adaptation. So there's surface level adaptations and deeper structure approaches that can be taken. And so you can see that on the surface level, things like using bilingual bicultural staff, maybe translating materials, using culturally specific styles, or identifying the sociocultural needs might fit into that. And I will say within service level, there's a range, right? So things like just providing an interpreter would be at the low end of the range. Actually translating all of your materials and having bilingual bicultural staff might be at the higher end of that range. And so, and I would say doing those last things, hiring bilingual bicultural staff and translating materials, goes a long way. I think that's a huge thing in terms of taking an existing intervention and adapting it. But then if you want to take a deeper structure approach, you want to embed the cultural values and practices. And I could see where this might be really important for some of the presentations that were done here. how social, cultural, and environmental factors influence health-related behaviors and practice. Super, super important there. And I can talk a little bit more specifically about each study and how I think that falls. But I also want to share with you sort of a model or a process, right, for culturally adapting. And if you think about each of the three presentations, they're all in here somewhere, right? So some of these stages are going to be iterated again, or you might go back to a stage. And so I think all of the studies identified a need and interest. The community partnership building, super, super important. I'll talk a little bit more about that and talking about the presentations. And so you have to do that at some point, obviously, lit review on the population that you're working on and identifying what is the intervention you want to adapt. And so those two, like community partnership and literature reviews, that could be happening simultaneously, not necessarily in this order. And then you create or adapt your curriculum. And I think in this case, a couple of the presentations didn't actually do adaptation, but they just tried their existing intervention as is, except with some minor adaptations like having an interpreter or having a bilingual interventionist. And so that's another way you could do it. You could try that and then see what changes should be made and go back through the iteration, right? Develop a new approach and then try it again. And so there are different ways that you might go about doing that, but it's always going to be like, also getting feedback from the community is always good. Once you get your, you adapt your approach, it's good to present that to your stakeholders so that they can give you feedback on that approach. So you could tweak it a little bit before you implement it. And so those are different stages that you might use. And these are kind of stages that I know Kuhn et al. Had done, reviewed a lot of literature on cultural adaptation. And these are things that most of the articles she reviewed outlined, that they all had in common. So I'm going to stop sharing now and just talk about the, let's see if I can get to you guys. Here we go. Just talk about the different studies and how they kind of fit in this. And then I definitely want to open it up and give time for questions. So I don't want to take all of the time for that, because I know we have a nice audience and it'll be nice to have some questions. And so just looking at Jonathan Safer-Lichtenstein's project, really great project looking at feasibility and acceptability of two parenting interventions. So I like the idea that they're doing a comparative approach, comparing two different versions of an intervention, two different types of intervention, the behavioral parent training, and I think, if I understand it correctly, it was behavioral parent training with mindfulness added to it. And so they had a really good sample size for this. They really intentionally tried to reach out to Spanish-speaking families, and they also had a substantial number of English-speaking Latino families as well. So that was a really good thing to do, because it's nice to compare. And when we think about Spanish-speaking families, and you probably, Jonathan, have this data, but it's usually a proxy for immigrant families, right? So it might be that 90% of the families, Spanish-speaking families, are immigrants or something like that. And so we're really thinking about that. We're really thinking about families who are maybe not as familiar with our service systems, with our processes, with our terminology and how we're labeling children with disabilities. And so they're coming to the United States with that limited knowledge. And so I think that really speaks to the findings that they had, where they found that the Spanish-speaking families really appreciated the psychoeducation piece, but they were not as comfortable maybe with the mindfulness piece. And so that could be because they're immigrant families, first of all, they're coming to the table with limited knowledge about all these different things. And so they really enjoyed and appreciated all the knowledge and information that they're getting, and that's really what they valued. Whereas the English-speaking families, maybe they had some of that knowledge already, and that's why they didn't value it as much. But they appreciated the mindfulness technique, because here in the United States, that's sort of a cultural thing that people are getting into, right? So that's really good. And I think that you know, you guys had a bilingual interventionist, which is fantastic, bicultural interventionist. And I don't know if you translated the materials in Spanish, but that would be the next step. And so that goes a long way. But now you're going to take this data and figure out what is the next phase of this, right? I think it's really interesting that they really like that sense of community, the peers. That doesn't surprise me. I think having people like themselves that they can talk to and realize that they're not the only ones. I mean, that's just standard, but really valuable for the Latino and Spanish speaking families. And those are immigrants, right, that may not know that many families. It's interesting that I can't read my own note on this one, so I'm just going to move on a little bit. But you know, I would ask the question to Jonathan and his team. You know, what's your next stage in terms of your iterative process? What changes will you make to the program, and you know, and how will you engage the community in doing that? I'm going to move on to talk about Kristina Lopez's project, and she took Parents Taking Action, which of course I'm very familiar with, and Kristina and I worked together on that project, and added pivotal response training, which I think is really good because PTA is a psychoeducational program, but you know, families wanting to have that sort of coaching with their children on evidence-based strategies, and PRT offers that aspect of it. I really like the way Kristina gave a rich description about community engagement, and that's a good example. All of these projects need to have community engagement, and you probably have, just maybe didn't present it in some cases, but really engaging the community to get their support, to find out what the lay of the land is, what things are going to work like on the ground, you know, all of that's super important anytime you're going to do an intervention with a different community. Even though, you know, Kristina did it being new to Arizona for sure, but even just with a diverse community, that would be a good reason to have that. And I think, and Kristina had a combination of service level and deep structural level, right? Because PTA was more of a deep structural creation of an intervention for a cultural group, whereas PRT was implemented with bilingual staff, it sounds like, but maybe not adapted specifically. And so I'm really interested, Kristina, in knowing more about how the PRT went, because the findings that you presented are very similar to findings that PTA has done in the past. So how is this different? What kind of outcomes maybe did this add to it? How did families receive the PRT part of it? So that will be an interesting thing, maybe next in the process, but thinking about what's next. And then lastly, I want to talk about Anne-Marie Martin's presentation. Her and colleagues looked at social validity of peers for Latino families, culturally linguistically diverse families, and 3 of them were Spanish speaking, and it sounds like they had an interpreter, but maybe not a Spanish speaking interventionist in this case. I thought the feedback from the families and the youth were really important. I mean, were really interesting because it seems like they did value the content, the group dynamics, didn't like the homework, and or logistics. The logistics were challenging. So I don't know if those two were similar part of each other, but yeah, homework sounds bad, right? Sometimes we, in our interventions, we say home activities because we don't like the word homework, but even then it's challenging, and it depends on what the homework is, right? So, and you guys talk about homework being actually getting together with individuals, having assignments, inviting people over, you know, and I'd be interested in knowing more what that looked like. But I'm wondering if you considered, you know, so you had Spanish-speaking families, English-speaking families. Spanish-speaking families, again, probably more immigrant. If you considered more cultural matching. So, I mean, the immigrant families maybe feel a lot more comfortable with other immigrant families in this intervention. And that way, you know, you might not have the challenge of, I'm worried about inviting these people over my house, or, you know, things like that. And there could be a class issue too. I mean, you may have middle high income white folks with low income immigrants, and they don't want to invite them over their house, right? It could be a class issue, not just culture. And so I think it's really important to think through that, what you're asking the families to do. And it seems like the families did suggest maybe get-togethers with family members. And I think this is something, if you explore the cultural issues of social skills within Latino families, which I think there's not enough written about this, not enough research, that one of the things you'll find is in many cases, especially if you have multi-generations, a lot of the social activities are with family, cousins, aunts, uncles, things like that. And so maybe helping to enhance social skills among cousins that play together, that sort of thing might be comfortable for some families to start with. So those are great things to think about, and also interested to see what you think is next in the process. Like, how are you going to change and adapt this intervention for these families and then try it again? And so now I am going to open it up. I'm going to look at the Q&A, and I'll just ask the questions here and have you guys jump in to answer the questions. And if there's time, you could answer my questions, but like my main question to all of you is, what's the next step in the iterative process for you? So Keisha Martinez Torres asked, I would like to know a little more about the focus groups, how the focus groups looked. Were there guided questions? And I'm not sure if they're referring to Jonathan's, maybe, because Jonathan, you talked about doing focus groups. Do you want to answer that?
Sure. That one. So we had focus, obviously we were doing them over Zoom because it was within the last year. So we had two focus groups for parents who did the behavioral parent training plus mindfulness, 2 focus groups for those who did behavioral parent training plus the psychoeducation support groups. So they were loosely guided questions. So just things like, tell us about what you liked most or what was most relevant about the intervention for you. What was least relevant, what challenges, barriers did you run into, and then sort of how was the cultural fit. And so I think that we then, for coding, we did thematic analysis, myself and another graduate student, looking for descriptive codes, kind of an exploratory nature, and then did that across the groups, and then sort of reconciled the codes that we had each found to come to some consensus codes. And then speaking to your question about sort of next steps, I think taking a lot of the, obviously, so Cami is one of the co-PIs of this step ideas too, but just from my portion, I think kind of going through that iterative process you described with this new information that we have from doing the groups once just as this direct translation version, taking the feedback from parents on what could be modified to be more culturally relevant. So making video examples look more like them, making the videos sort of more up to date, more realistic scenarios, more diverse participants, things like that. Other suggestions included like incorporating other family members as much as possible into the intervention. We sort of allowed parents to bring like one other caregiver with them to these, but perhaps with these groups, just incorporating other, aunts, uncles, other family members who are involved in the child raising, and just trying to include more family, just because we know the community aspect was so highly valued by participants.
Great, thank you, Jonathan.
I can add
really
maybe
quick?
Yeah.
a few points there.
Oh, I was just going to suggest that, Sandy, if you mute your mic when the others are talking, we're getting like a little bit of feedback.
Okay, sorry. Thanks, Drew. And I saw Laura Lee put a question in the chat about this because we've been talking a lot about this. So I'll be super fast, but this adaptation, so to speak, is grew out of an earlier, our sort of with our MAPS project a couple of years ago. We did the mindfulness-based stress reduction where we had an interpreter. And so sort of half of the families were Spanish speaking, and we did focus groups after that. And the main thing that came up is don't use an interpreter. we don't like that. We want to be with Spanish speaking families, and probably a lot of the, as a proxy for immigration status and stuff like that. So, but we did find that the mindfulness intervention was kind of equally effective for Latino families. But what's been interesting in Jonathan's work is that it shows that it's not as
well received, I think, as the psychoeducation. And so we did these focus groups again, and really tried to ask about, sort of cultural fit and stuff like that. And I think that's one area, and I saw Laura Lee wrote this question too, is where we've been trying to be intentional and ask about what we need to adapt, but don't want to make any assumptions and adapt things that they like and that are working. And so it's been kind of a slow iterative process for us. We do something and then we do focus groups, and then we try to adapt. Just to be totally honest, this is not my area of expertise. We work in an area with a really large Latino population, and we did these groups because we had so many Latino Spanish-speaking families that came to us, asking for this intervention. And so it's kind of been in response to who's responded to our recruitment. So, for Laura Lee and I, to be totally honest, I think we sort of learned on the fly and tried to seek a lot of consultation, but I think we'd be curious as well, and don't want to take up any more time, but just to hear any thoughts about what else we could do to make sure we are being as, culturally responsive and thoughtful and things that we might, consider for further adaptation when continuing to serve these families.
And I really like the way you guys have taken that feedback initially, that they want to be together, right, and have that sense of community, and you actually implemented that. So you are actually in a second iteration in terms of this process. But yeah, I wonder if if we're talking about the Spanish-speaking, particularly immigrant families specifically, it might be good, and maybe you did this in the focus groups, but to sort of, how with cognitive interviewing, you present questions or things like that from your measures, but in this case, presenting, okay, we're planning to, maybe with a group that's completely new, we're planning to do these mindfulness techniques and just get general feedback about mindfulness and how they might receive that. The other thing I would think is, because they need psychoeducation so much, and your study showed that, maybe start with psychoeducation, do however many weeks that is, and then have another phase of the intervention where they move on to mindfulness. That could be another approach. So I'm going to move on to Kristina. There's a question for Dr. Lopez. And Barbara Kaplan said the community partners work is so important. Can you elaborate on your on-the-ground recruitment methods? What did you find successful in recruiting?
Sure. So, and Sandy, don't forget to mute yourself, because then there's feedback. It's okay. It was a lot of meetings at McDonald's, meetings in the park, meetings at community centers, wherever I was told to go and told to meet. And word of mouth. So I was, one community advocate telling me, you got to talk to this mom, and you got to talk to this mom, and you got to talk to this mom. And I just followed the trail of talking to every mom. I'm Latina, or I don't actually identify as Latina all the time. I'm more Mexican American, coming from California. But I'm not a Spanish speaker. And that's never been a barrier for me working with my own community. So I just did what I do as a community member. And I was welcomed. And they let me know all the time what was happening, who to talk to, who not to talk to, what autism organizations were very welcoming of the Latino community, what autism organizations were not at all and did not service them well. I really got the inside scoop. And even though the organization I ended up working with wasn't actually very welcoming in the sense that doesn't take Medicaid, they still were the primary organization that was able to train the bilingual students, the bilingual Latina students. And so recruitment was really just a process of me running all over Phoenix and talking to everybody, and then also visiting different support groups for Spanish-speaking families, and What else? Word of mouth. Once one mom knows, she tells the other moms, and that's what it was. And then Facebook. That was also a very good resource. So those were the main on the ground tools. I'm using the same methods for a cancer study for Latino families. That's not so helpful right now because of COVID, though. It's proving to be nearly impossible. So there are, checks and balances when it comes to what's happening in reality.
Great, thank you. And Yuvia asked a question which is really interesting about whether you provided psychoeducation on why it's important for caregivers to practice self-care and mindfulness. And I think that might be an important addition, right? To have a whole session on the importance of it, because we actually developed an intervention called By Caring for Myself for Latino mothers of children with IDD that really goes into detail about helping mothers understand why they have to take care of themselves, because it's like the airplane thing, right? But they have to take care of the family, the child, everybody else is first, not themselves. And so you really have to drive that point home and then get into your content. So that's another approach. And just so that there's time, maybe we can let Anne-Marie maybe answer the broader question of what is the next phase in the iteration process for you. And I'm gonna go to mute.
Yeah, thank you. So Peers is such a complex program, and there's so many different levels to it that it's really hard to convey all of the different nuances within a 10-minute presentation. But I definitely think next steps would be to naturally repeat the program within our area, but actually incorporate some of those suggestions that I feel were really crucial to increasing the comfort of some of the families. One of the things that we did do for this one is, as a result of not being able to recruit enough families to have one Spanish-speaking primary group, one English-speaking group, we kind of just put them together and delivered it simultaneously in both languages. And so I think that's where some of the comfort came from. Okay, it feels inclusive and we have the support, but at the same time, there were actual program facets, which were what the issue was. So, one of the things that I found the most impactful is that families really felt uncomfortable inviting outside people into their home that they didn't know. And so allowing them to have get-togethers within the group. So inviting these other kids that they had gotten to know already and have kind of like a budding relationship would help bridge them to inviting just like classmates over, which is, the concept of the get together, which is not allowed in the traditional peers. But I think for this sample, having the option to invite people that they were already comfortable with would help them get to that point. So yeah, I just think, running it again and, incorporating all of this, I feel like hopefully would really make a difference.
I hate to cut this conversation short, but I think we're a few minutes over. I'll leave it up to you. You're welcome to click on stages and you can create a session to continue the conversation. But we need to prepare for the next symposium.
If anyone wants to do that.
I think we got through most of the questions that are on
we did.
here. So
we did.
We'll look forward to seeing you guys in other sessions. Thanks so much for attending.
Thank you.